Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. We are in the second section of Aviva Zornberg on Terumah, and this is one of those ones that fairly decently stands on its own, and I think I found incredibly rich and poetic and really thoughtful, both on the purported topic to start with, which is the experience of how Moshe was instructed to make the Mishkan, and then the direction that she goes to about Moshe's hands, which I thought was really rich for further development beyond what she does anywhere in this chapter. I think there's a lot more to do with it. So I'm going to grab my book. I apologize that the scan this time did not have the footnotes, so I'll try to make sure those get sent around with next week's text so that you have them, because there's some, I think, really wonderful references, both midrashic and psychoanalytical, that are great to have handy. So here we go. I'll share my screen. We can begin. Okay, disparity, the vision of fire and the earthly model. On several occasions, God adds to God's instructions a phrase referring to a vision of the model of the Mishkan, which was shown to Moshe on Har Sinai. In the initiating sequence, for example, we find, "Let them make me a sanctuary," the famous words from very early on in the Parashah, "Vasuli Mikdash," and then continuing in the next pasuk, "Exactly as I show you, Kechol asher ani mar'e otcha, et tavnit hamishkan ve'et tavnit kol kelav," the pattern of the Mishkan and the pattern of all its furnishings, kein ta'asu, that's how you should make it. So just flipping the order of that pasuk, you should make it, kein ta'asu, Kechol asher ani mar'e otcha, exactly as I show you. In similar vein, at the end of the chapter, we find, Ur'ei va'aseh, look and make them, ketavnitam, according to the patterns for them, asher ata hor'eta bahar, that were shown, that are being shown to you on the mountain. And you can see her italics on the ways in which the root resh aleph hey, seeing, showing, or being shown, appear. Kechol asher ani mar'e otcha, exactly as I show you, and then ur'ei, look at it, and make it according to the pattern, asher ata hor'eta, that are being shown you on the mountain. Those are sort of brackets, essentially, of chapter 25, the beginning of the instructions for the Mishkan. This visual resource is found, as Kasuto points out, in the very passages where the lack of details is most noticeable. Much of what is essential for the purpose of fashioning the tabernacle, the Mishkan, is not in the book. We're already noticing that, the instructions, for all that there's so much discussion of the fact that there's so much discussion of the Mishkan. In other words, we have Terumah and Tetzaveh giving all the instructions, and then Vayakal and Pekudei reiterating them, and so much ink is spilled, to give this blueprint. For all of that, actually, it's incomplete. We don't have everything we need in these passages in order for a person to build a Mishkan based on them. And in fact, in some of the spots where the details are particularly sparse, there is this accompanying recognition that there is a visual model that went with it. Right? The text does not provide a completely detailed manual for the construction of the Mishkan. The Midrash explores some unexpected implications of this realization. This is a Midrash from Bamidbar Rabbah, sort of classic Midrash Rabbah on Parashat Shavua. Rabbi Yoshua of Sichnin, in the name of Rabbi Levi, said, when God told Moshe, make me a Mishkan, should he, this is Moshe, should he not have erected 4 pegs and stretched the Mishkan tent over them? But it teaches you that God showed Moses up above a red fire, a green fire, a black fire, a white fire, and told him, Make it according to the pattern that you are being shown on the mountain. Rabbi Berechia, in the name of Rabbi Batzla, said, this is like a king. Interesting, just noticing now, Batzla, a very unusual name, has a little bit of echoes of Bezalel, considered the chief architect or chief builder of the Mishkan. It's interesting. I'd be curious to look and see where else that name appears. Rabbi Berechia, in the name of Rabbi Batzla, said, this is like a king who had a splendid garment made of jewels. He said to his personal friend, make me one just like it. He answered, my lord the king, can I make one like it? The king replied, I remain in my glory, but you have your materials. Similarly, Moshe said to God, my God, can I make anything like these fires? God replied, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, listing the materials for the Mishkan. And now it's being explicated further by the Midrash. What did God mean then by providing those materials after having shown the fire? God said, if you make what is above below, I shall leave my palace above and descend and condense my presence among them below. It's a lot here, and she has a few further comments and reflections now on this Midrash. The paradoxical perspective begins with the description of what Moshe should have done. Simply set up 4 pegs and stretch a tent over them. In other words, making a sanctuary for God is so blatantly absurd that the most authentic response would have been a minimalistic one, not to gild the lily, as it were. Right? It's impossible. If we contemplate the idea of making a housing for God on earth, it's so impossible, incomprehensible, that just make it as simple as possible. That's the sort of, as soon as God had told Moshe initially, Asuli Mikdash, or make me a Mishkan, or maybe this is even referring specifically to the Mishkan, which actually 2 years ago, I think, with Rav Meidan, we studied his essay on Terumah, where he talked about the different covers, the Mishkan and the Ohel. The Mishkan was the inner cover, the cloth cover, and the Ohel, the outer cover, was the seal skin, goats and goat's hair covers, and the different significances and symbolisms of them. And that at the most basic level, the word Mishkan refers to that cloth cover, right? So specifically, this Midrash may be saying, when God told Moshe specifically about Vasita Mishkan, make the actual Mishkan, that refers to the specific cover. So maybe you should have just stretched out that cover on the 4 pegs, and that would be enough. But it was much more complicated than that. So the paradoxical perspective begins with the description of what Moshe should have done. I read that already. Good. Here, in God's proposal of a building project, resonances of the past are heard. This is, I think, the first of her particularly unique contributions, although it sounds like, I had not seen this anywhere else. Here, reading this again. Here, in God's proposal of a building project, resonances of the past are heard, of Egyptian building projects in which the individual was submerged, of those store cities, arei miskenot, of which the Talmud delineated 2 possibilities. Either they endanger, misaknot, their builders, or they impoverish them, mimashkenot. So the reference here is to a passage in the Talmud, which I believe is talking about the 2 meanings of this strange word for the storehouses, the storage cities, the arei miskenot. What I think she's pointing out is what I had not noticed before, which is the relationship between the word Mishkan and arei miskenot, right? That there's this echo when Bnei Yisrael are now being told to build a Mishkan, they can't help but hear something that takes them back to their prior building project. And that prior building project was, we don't even need the Talmudic interpretations to tell us, it was part of their slave labor. And the Midrash makes it even worse. It endangered their lives, unsafe conditions, or the extremely hard work, or because they were conscripted into this work and at little or no pay, it took away their opportunity for a more expansive livelihood. So they and here she sort of talks about they lost their individuality along the way. Either way, all of that are the resonances which are brought up when they're being told make a mishkan. Right? In either case, One might imagine a visceral Israelite revulsion to the idea of an elaborate construction project, right? I want to pause on this moment, just sort of appreciate, right? For us, we sort of bifurcate, I think, these stories. We got out of Egypt, we're free, we got to Har Sinai, we got the Torah, so much has happened in between, and now we're being told to build this Mishkan. Whether we take it in the classic debate between the Rashi and the Ramban, whether we take it as a response to the Egel HaZahav, a kind of atonement type of structure, or an always intended portable Har Sinai that was given before the sin of the golden calf. Either way, it's this amazing place for God's residence, something people would have been excited to construct. But she reminds us that we actually have to compress these two events because they're not that far removed from each other. I mean, weeks earlier, the Jewish people were slaves. They were, again, keeping in mind the 10 plagues, over time, but in recent memory, they were building, their main work was building these complex structures. And now they've exchanged their servitude to Paro for servitude for God. And one of the first things God tells them is, build me this complex structure. There's something to that. But God then shows Moses a model of the Mishkan made of 4 fires. Whatever the particular symbolic significances of the 4 colors may be, and she doesn't actually tell us, but something to think about, why red, green, black, and white. It is remarkable that what God has done effectively is to complicate Moses's task. Showing him a model has not helped him to comprehend the project better, right? He sees the fires and Moshe says, how am I supposed to do anything like that? It didn't help Moshe, it made it harder. On the contrary, it makes him recoil. My God, can I make anything like these? As in the analogy with the king and his jeweled robe, Moses is paralyzed by the incommensurate grandeur of the model. Even its materials far transcend his resources. God's demand to make a replica of the fiery model is existentially beyond his means. How to use fire, now this is sort of the next, moving, I think, into the next part. She's going to continue to talk about the question of this model, but she's already now moving into the next piece, which is the particular choice of fire as the material, so to speak, for the visual model. How to use fire, which destroys boundaries and categories, in order to create a distinct structure in which God may dwell. God's answer is apparently simple. Like the king who says, I remain in my glory while you work with your materials, God lists yarn and linens and declares them the human materials for making what is above below. In other words, for replicating the fires. Not only will God not be insulted by the travesty of the reproduction, God will descend from God's fiery habitation and dwell in the human structure. In what sense, one may ask, is this structure of cheap materials like the fiery original? What is the condition for God's descent, for the tzimtzum, the condensation of God's presence? To offer another analogy, Lance, here's looking at you, is this not like an attempt to translate Shakespeare into Pidgin English? One understands Moses' recoil. Why has God complicated matters by showing the vision of fires? And what would it mean to make a copy of these fires in wools and woods? I'm going to stop here for a moment because I think we've already introduced a number of, I think, significant points. One, the awareness that the Midrash, the idea, I think, just paying attention to, sometimes we really do gloss over it, the idea that there is insufficient detail in the instructions of the Torah, but accompanying it, it's clear there was some visual model shown to Moshe. That I think is an interesting important pshat reminder on its own. Then the question of kind of what was that visual model, the Midrash's suggestion of it being this fiery model, and then her points. First, the complexity for Bnei Israel of being asked to build a Mishkan, this complex building structure on the heels of their oppression being through building, that she almost makes that as a side point. And then her further reading of the Midrash about kind of the way in which the Midrash's description of what was shown to Moshe seems to actually make things harder to understand or harder to replicate. And the answer to that is basically God says, don't worry about it. And then she leaves us with these questions, sort of what do we understand about models from this, and what is Moshe supposed to do now, having been shown this, and what does it mean that this is a copy or a model? So I think those were all a lot of first points, and happy to take any questions, comments, or reactions thus far. Lance, go ahead.
I'm reminded of the play Much Ado About Nothing. And to someone who is not Shakespearean, not a scholar anyway, the word nothing has implications. It's nonsense. It's not worth thinking about. But from what scholars have put together, the word nothing in Shakespeare's day was pronounced noting. And noting has many different meanings beyond simply something that is fluffy or not appropriate. It can mean noting in someone, looking at something, making notes about something. It could also mean woman. But it brings up the problem of translation. And this is one of my pet peeves in a way. As I explained in the case of the word boy, if you recall, Rav Stephen, how do you translate that? Not it's mistranslation as far as I'm concerned, certainly. And I think what Professor Zornberg is very correct about it, is that we really tread on thin ice when we translate. And the problem is, what did the text mean in the original to the original audience? And that's a problem. And I think putting Shakespeare into pidgin English means that you're really opening up Shakespeare to any possible interpretation. And certainly scholars, I think, would argue that using the word existentialism is really an unfortunate projection.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts, comments before we keep going? Great, there's a lot more ahead, so we will continue from here. Okay, vision complicates. We're about to get to a long footnote, which I want to read to you as well. The vision serves an ambiguous purpose. In some sense, it furthers the building project, but at the same time, it deconstructs the very possibility of such a project. Whatever guidance it provides, it is clearly not of the construction manual type, illustrating for practical clarity. It is virtually an anti-Mishkan vision, exacerbating Moses's original skepticism, right? So at some level, the vision here makes it harder, and therefore it's like it doesn't look like the Mishkan, and yet it's supposed to illustrate something. So what is it doing? Dynamically, the Midrash has followed an unusual course, beginning with a relatively unproblematic solution, the minimalist tent. And she notes in the footnote there that that's what the word Mishkan literally means, and progressing to a sense of quandary, which is not entirely resolved in God's final gnomic utterance. If you will make what is above below, etc. Vision does not clarify, it complicates. That's sort of her first point, and she's sort of building that into what she describes as an unusual midrashic approach. What I understand, the best of my understanding, her to be saying is that a midrash usually kind of poses questions, challenges, complicates things, and then tries to bring it to some kind of resolution. And this midrash offers this sort of simple solution and then winds up with something more complicated. And I think she sees that as heightening the idea, or further proving the ways in which vision complicates. Seeing something which is supposed to help you figure out how to do something sometimes makes it harder. On this footnote 24, I'm going to read to you some excerpts. This is from Don Handelman and David Schulman's God Inside Out. The term model is common in English language usage to Lance's point about trying to really drill down on what is something actually meaning, or what's the relevant meaning for this circumstance. The term model is common in English language usage. In its dictionary rendition, for example, a model may refer to a standard, an example used as a canon, and to a representation or pattern in miniature of something to be made on a larger scale. These definitions contain two aspects, thinking and doing, that are often attributed to the concept. A model is good for thinking with, a standard, a canon, or for doing with, a miniature of something to be made. This usage parallels the broad distinctions between knowing that and knowing how, which are made by Gilbert Ryle, and those between models of and models for, which are made by Clifford Geertz, who based his usage on Ryle's. Okay, so just I think really fascinating thinking about what a model is. It could be a tool that helps you figure out how to think about something, or it could be a physical thing which helps you figure out how to make something larger in some sense. And those are a model of thinking and model of doing. The Mishkan model deployed, now so that was a quote, and now we get back to her words in this footnote. The Mishkan model deployed in these midrashic sources is obviously a model for and offered as an aid in knowing how, right? It's much more about some way of giving Moshe a sense of what the Mishkan is or is supposed to be, how to think about the Mishkan. In a less obvious sense, however, the other meaning emerges as the important one, as difficulties gather around the practical usage. So maybe I said that backwards. Hold on. No, I'm not sure. Knowing how. I think so. In a less obvious sense, however, the other meaning emerges as the important one, as difficulties gather around the practical usage. Okay. Another midrash, back to the text. Another midrash in a similar vein deals with the fashioning of the menorah. So up until now, we've been talking about the textual references to the as you were shown, to the visual model for the Mishkan in its entirety, or maybe somehow referring more specifically to the Mishkan as the cover, but probably the Mishkan in its entirety. And we raised questions based on the Midrash about that. Now she wants to bring a parallel from specifically the menorah. Another Midrash in a similar vein deals with the fashioning of the menorah. Three things gave Moshe difficulty: the fashioning of the menorah, the laws of the new moon, and of insects. What was the problem in fashioning the menorah? When Moshe ascended the mountain, God showed him how to fashion the Mishkan. When God showed him the construction of the menorah, Moses had difficulty. So God said, "Look, I am fashioning it in front of you." What did God do? God showed him white fire, red fire, black fire, green fire, and of them fashioned the menorah with its cups and knobs, its blossoms and 6 branches. Right, the 6 branches because the center one is not a branch but a trunk, and said to him, "This is the work of the menorah." That's a quote of the text, "V'zeh ma'aseh ha-menorah," and picking up, as she's going to point out later, as the rabbis often do, as the Midrash often does, the word zeh hints to some very particular thing someone can point at, a kind of a visual depiction of some kind, right? So when the Torah says zeh ma'aseh ha-menorah, that's a hook that the Midrash can pick up on to say, oh, God was showing Moshe something in particular with this vessel, and thus build the idea of a visual depiction, showing him with God's finger. Nevertheless, Moshe had difficulty with it. Okay, so that wasn't enough. The fiery model and God fashioning it out of the fire wasn't enough. What did God do? God engraved it upon Moshe's hand and told him, "Descend and fashion it as I have engraved it upon your hand." As it is said, "Look and fashion them according to their patterns," a pasuk we already referenced that refers more broadly to the Mishkan, but perhaps something about the urei, right? So if you're going to now look and make it according to the patterns, when you get back down from Har Sinai, so what are you going to look at? You can't see the fiery model that's up on the top of the mountain anymore. So there must be a pattern somewhere in your body, and that's the the engraving on the hand. Okay, so another amazing midrash. We see great similarities to the broader one of the fiery model of the Mishkan in its entirety, and this one specifically, the menorah. In a sense, they're actually maybe arguing with each other or different traditions, because this one seems to specify that it was the menorah that had this model, maybe not the entirety of the Mishkan, right? If we're told that God showed him how to fashion the Mishkan, and then Moshe had difficulty specifically with the menorah, and that one was in fire, maybe for this midrashic tradition, the rest of the Mishkan was shown in a different way, not with that four-colored fire model. Here, the ironies of vision proliferate. At first, God shows Moshe how to make the menorah. Moshe has difficulty, and God models the process for him. God demonstrates the whole complex dynamic of making, stage by stage, in 4 fires. The reference to God's finger is clearly didactic. The demonstrator points to significant details as he works. This is the work of the menorah. Nevertheless, Moshe had difficulty. Nevertheless, it's perhaps genuinely surprising that Moshe finds the learning process so hard, since God is such an understanding and lucid teacher, even using different colors for the model, right? She's sort of just really trying to read closely and say, what does it say? Nevertheless, Moshe had difficulty. And it's saying, because why should Moshe have difficulty? God is doing so many different things to teach Moshe, nevertheless. But surely that nevertheless has an ironic undertone. For these 4 fires again evoke the sense that the human being is being asked to live beyond his means, right? She's saying, on the one hand, they're nevertheless because God's such a good teacher. On the other hand, how could you imagine that Moshe would not have difficulty? God modeled it out of 4 colors of fire. How is Moshe supposed to follow that model? The clarity of the demonstration is, after all, specious. The project is out of Moshe's reach. Indeed, we notice that even before God shows Moshe the fiery prototype, the menorah was always difficult to fashion, right? Of all the vessels, its difficulty stems most obviously from its complexity. It is an artifact of Baroque detail and elaboration. But perhaps, I think this is another one of her particular insights, in addition, the difficulty lies in the association with fire. Not only the fashioning of the menorah, but its function will engage with fire. In some radical sense, this element must always be kashe, difficult, dense, though fluid, expressive of contrary powers. I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, Gaston Bachelard's words, literally from a book called The Psychoanalysis of Fire. Fire is a privileged phenomenon which can explain anything. All that changes quickly is explained by fire. Fire is the ultra-living element. It is intimate and it is universal. It lives in our heart. It lives in the sky. It rises from the depths of the substance and offers itself with the warmth of love. Or it can go back down into the substance and hide there, latent and pent up, like hate and vengeance. Among all phenomena, it is really the only one to which there can be so definitely attributed the opposing values of good and evil. Sort of a bold claim, but it certainly resonates. I don't know if I would say among all phenomena, but that sort of sense, I think we often talk about that, about light or fire, that it, but in particular fire, that it can be so destructive and so generative. And that certainly comes up around Tisha B'Av with the Midrashim about how God is going to God destroyed the Beit HaMikdash in fire and will rebuild it in fire. Very connected to these Midrashim, that somehow it's going to come down in fire, or fire will be the model for the rebuilt Beit HaMikdash. So it's sort of both the ultimate force of destruction and the ultimate generative substance, right? So that makes fire, and therefore the menorah, which is the holder of fire, a thing which is itself particularly difficult. Even if it weren't an elaborate structure, itself would be particularly difficult to fashion, contend with, understand. Going to stop the share and pause here for a minute and be right back. Okay, great. Since we paused anyway, if anyone wants to comment on what we've seen so far, please feel free, and then we'll try to do some of the last pages before we're out of time. All right, we'll keep going. Oh, Lance, a quick thought. I couldn't tell if you were unmuting.
Okay. I'd like to read a definition of deconstruction, if I may.
Please.
Because she uses the word, and the word has a very important meaning. I think. Let me just, if I may, let me just read this. The word deconstruction comes from the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Deconstruction involves analyzing texts and uncovering the contradictions, ambiguities, and paradoxes that underline their meaning. Derrida argued that there was no inherent meaning in language, and that meaning was always deferred or postponed, endlessly deferring any fixed or stable meaning. This meant that texts, for example, the Torah we're reading, were always open to multiple interpretations, and that no single interpretation could be considered authoritative. Now, what does that mean, for what Professor Zornberger is saying? I just don't understand how she's using the word. She uses it once, and I don't understand the context. Which, do you understand it, Stephen?
Let me see if I can go back to that. I'm looking for where deconstruction was. Here it deconstructs. Let me share my screen again. The vision serves an ambiguous purpose. In some sense, it furthers the building project, but at the same time, it deconstructs the very possibility of such a project.
It seems to me that she's using the term almost as subversive, right? Undermining. Which is fine, and I think probably accurate, but I don't think the word deconstruct is really what she wants to say. I mean, she tends to sort of show off her knowledge. Gaston Bachelard, for example, who is a really lightweight philosopher, and I mean, anyway, that's not the point, but she has a good point here, which talks about the ambiguous purpose and the project, and talking about this project and undermining it. But I just don't understand really what she's trying to say here.
Fair. Well, we'll put an asterisk by her use of deconstructs there, and I appreciate that.
Bachelard is someone who attempts to reconcile religion with science, and he's a rationalist, I think. And again, I don't think rationalists are very good for Torah and Tanakh and Talmud. I mean, they're not rational.
Right. I hear it. All right, good. We'll keep going as well. Okay, so having quoted him, she then concludes here, in the Mishkan, fire's continual presence is represented by the menorah. Moshe's initial difficulty is therefore not surprising. What is arresting is God's modeling in fires, with its dubious alleviation of the original difficulty, right? So just to emphasizing that point, the whole notion, the Midrash just says there's Moshe is shown a model. The model for the Midrash or in reality or whatever could have been made out of anything. So the choice of fire is interesting and surprising because it seems like the kind of thing that wouldn't clarify, but would further complicate or preserve the impossibility that the Mishkan represents. So it's interesting that it's chosen. I would just say as an aside, God is often, what I've learned from Professor Benjamin Sommer is that whatever sense we have of any possibility of a corporeal or a physically perceivable divine presence in the Bible in biblical times was a fire. God is described as Eish Ochla, going all the way back to the burning bush. So the idea that God models something with fire doesn't feel surprising for a God who, if that God ever had any physicality, it might have been fire. So I think the Midrash is probably building on that as well. Okay, now we're going to go one layer deeper from that next stage of the Midrash, where Moshe, in not being able to understand the fire, had the model engraved in his palm. And I think this is, again, gets to the piece of Moshe's hands. We won't get all the way into it, but I think it's a really rich field for exploration. Okay, the solution, palm knowledge. God's solution is compelling. God engraves a model of the menorah on Moshe's hand and tells him to copy it, see it, and make it. The transcendent fires are essentially tattooed onto his hand, right? I mean, it's hard to know what that model on Moshe's hand looks like, but if stage 1 was showing the fire and stage 2 was an engraving on Moshe's hand, so in some sense, the fires are tattooed onto his hand. This image is haunting. If we try to tease out some of its implications, we may say first that Moshe's hands are now engraved with a vision. The connection between hand and eye is made taut. Seeing and making become intimate, secretly linked. For it is not simply a drawing on Moses' hand, though even that would focus attention on the hand as that part of the body that can be consulted, that is part of oneself and yet external to oneself. But the description of engraving is a tactile one. It is an invasive procedure whose scars will leave Moses with a personal manual. I assume that it's in quotes here because the idea of manual relating to, in various languages, the hands, something which is done by hand. So she's playing here on the word, and appropriately, that a manual means something about how something is done with the hands. And this is literally of the hands. A manual in the true sense of the Mishkan. Inscribed deep within his flesh, he will carry with him a version of the fiery model. In a modest, intimate place on the palm of the hand, he will bear the mark of transcendence. This chakikah, that's the language that the Midrash used there, this chakikah, the engraving, evokes that other intimate mark, the inscription of circumcision. That mark is described by Derrida as that singular and immemorial archive, which, though never leaving you, nonetheless has come about and is no less exterior right on your body proper. As with circumcision, Moses' hand inscription involves an incision into the skin, which never leaves, but is not innate, which is interior and exterior at the same time. Like circumcision, it becomes a tactile archive, making oblivion impossible. We find an illuminating use of this imagery in Isaiah chapter 49, verses 14 to 16. Zion says, God has forsaken me, God has forgotten me. For our Isaiah class, we learned this not that long ago. Can a woman forget her baby or disown the child of her womb? Though she might forget, I never could forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. I remember when we studied this in our Thursday morning Tanakh class in Yeshaya, when we're doing Yeshayahu, we really spent some time on this because it's such a powerful imagery. We've spoken about the rare times where God contacts human beings, but here God is sort of placing the human being into God's own self. The absurdity of a woman's forgetting her baby, who is the child of her womb, part of her proper body, though now external to it, is marshaled to illustrate the impossibility of God's forgetting God's people. Although, of course, we have to recognize that in the Pasuk, that absurdity is actually rendered possible, whereas God's remembering of the Jewish people is impossible, right? We commented on that in class when we studied it then, right? Can a woman forget her baby or disown the child of her womb? Our answer would be no. And the text answer is, it's actually theoretically possible, but what's not possible is that God would forget the Jewish people. I have engraved you on the palms of my hands, Rashi says, to see you and remember you constantly. This is Derrida's immemorial archive, a stored awareness, imprinted, palpable, as well as visible. So the same thing that God does for the Jewish people on God's self, God is now doing a version of God's menorah, so to speak, on Moshe's self. In a simple sense, God's strategy with Moses is that of a teacher whose pupil has a learning problem. He adds the sense of touch to the register of sense stimuli. I think in our world of being more conscious of learning modalities and sensory issues and enhancements. This is a really lovely point. Moses will know the fiery model and be able to reproduce it, though through the palm knowledge that is a private sensation. An imprinted form is known by a sensitive caress of the skin. 1 second. The caress, and now we are quoting from, we've gone from Bachelard to Derrida, now we are at Levinas, from totality. The caress, like contact, is sensibility, but the caress transcends the sensible. The caress consists in seizing upon nothing, in soliciting what ceaselessly escapes its form toward a future never future enough, in soliciting what slips away as though it were not yet. It searches, it forages. It is not an intentionality of disclosure, but of search, a movement unto the invisible. Sorry for one more pause.
Yes. Is it Shavuot?
Okay, here we go.
I don't know.
Hold on 1 second, Lance. I'm going to try to go a little further, so I'll just hold your thought because there's so much more here and we have limited time. So I'm going to just go a little bit further. This caress represents an entirely different order of imagination than the one that sees the hand as grasping, mastering, powerful. This is the order of the tender, which designates a way, the way of remaining in the no man's land between being and not yet being. Now we're not going to, I have not read Levinas much, and we're not going to plumb the depths of this, but we're just going to take it where she wants to take it for now. Approaching the caress from an anthropological perspective, Elias Canetti writes of the pleasure of the fingers as the basis of the grooming instinct as a social procedure. I'm reading a little fast. We'll glean what we glean. I want to not gloss over it, but still come to the, take home from this. Even mobile, restless animals like monkeys display endless patience in grooming. Through it, the fingers become more and more sensitive. The feeling of many hair tips simultaneously engenders a particular sense of touch, which is entirely different from the crude sensation of snatching or grasping. From this sensitivity grows the ability to shape objects, to sew, to stroke. This is quite different from the hardening exercises of hands and fingers, the ceaseless confrontation with hardness, which leads to the use of the stick, the earliest weapon, the first in the long series of hard instruments. Here, the hand is the first vessel. The fingers of both hands intertwined are the first basket. The intimate experience of the hand enacting shapes precedes the making of these shapes, precedes even the perception of those shapes in nature. Quote, "It was the fingers forming a hollow to scoop up water which made the cup real. What man, with the help of his hands, enacted was only made long afterwards when it had been enacted often enough. Words and objects are accordingly the emanations and products of a single unified experience, representation by means of the hands. This transformation of the hand is the earliest incorporation into himself of all that represents human culture." Again, just really rich, thought-provoking stuff that I've never thought about what hands are and what they beget. This is the modality of the hands as the site of the caress, of tenderness, of the tentative as opposed to the tenacious, of groping as opposed to grasping, and of intimate formings and transformations that will generate culture. It is this motif that is introduced by the Midrash as God engraves the fiery model of the menorah into Moses' hand. And I don't think she says it at all later, but I think what she might be wanting us to think about is, in a certain sense, the parallel then between fire and hands. Fire as this ultimate, can be the most good and the most destructive, or most constructive and the most destructive, and the hands too as being able to be the most gentle and the most powerful. Okay, Moses' hands, a new modality. I'm just going to zip on through to the end and then we'll take last comments. This is a moment that gains significance from the central role Moses' hand has. So the moment of the engraving on Moses' hands is a moment that gains significance from the central role Moses' hand has played in the history of the Exodus. It is his hand, for instance, grasping the staff that has brought plagues down upon the Egyptians, that has charged the Red Sea to split apart. But a new modality of the hand begins, I suggest, when Moses holds his hands in the air and mysteriously conducts the fortunes of war in the battle against Amalek. In that enigmatic scene, Moses instructs Joshua to lead the Israelite force. For tomorrow I shall station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand, Mate Elohim biyadi. When, however, Moses is described at the top of the hill, there is no mention of the staff. Hold on one moment, guys. Sorry, a little extra activity here. Hold on. When, however, Moses is described at the top of the hill, there is no mention of the staff. As the Psukim say, whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew heavy, bidei Moshe kivedim. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus his hands remained steady until the sun set. Okay, so she's noting, of course, that he says he's going to walk up onto the hill with his mateh. But then when we hear about everything his hands do, there's no mateh. Strangely, the physical human weight of Moses' hands needs support if they are to remain steady, emunah. And yet in the previous verse, there is clearly no steadiness. His hands rise and fall, and with them the fortunes of war. Where indeed is the staff? Obviously not in his hand, asserts Ramban, for his hand gesture is nisiat kapaim, prisat kapaim, the classic gesture of the hands outspread in prayer. Open, defenseless, groping upward, not clenched around a weapon. This is the hand that brings victory on this occasion. In this gesture, according to one midrash, Moses models prayer to his people fighting below. In a surrealistic description, their involvement in battle is refigured as a miming of Moses' prayerful gestures. They saw Moshe kneeling down, and they knelt down, falling upon his face, and they fell upon their faces, spreading their hands to heaven. An existential stance is demonstrated by Moshe. The hand expresses the heart, as we find in the classic midrashic comment on the scene. Whenever Moshe held up his hand, Israel prevailed. Did Moses' hand make or break the fortunes of war? I think this is quoted even in a Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. But this teaches you that as long as the Israelites gazed upward and submitted their hearts to their Father in heaven, they would prevail. And if not, they would fail. An invisible line is drawn between Moshe's hands and the people's hearts. A subtle influence moves in both directions, directing a quest, seizing upon nothing, fed by its own hunger, a movement unto the invisible. To achieve this connection, the staff has to be dropped. The fingers must grope, caress, create a new form. This new hand is both delicate and heavy. It is the natural human hand, not the agent of miraculous power and destruction. If the Talmud asks with apparent naivete, did Moses' hands make or break the fortunes of war? The question acquires its force only here in this new modality. Before this, Moses' hands did indeed transform the destiny of the human and natural world, as he repeatedly wielded his staff to bring plagues of horror down upon the Egyptians. At this moment, however, the only power of the hands is as an extension of the heart, as a potent sign of yearning that affects the hearts of his people. It is this hand-heart connection that determines the fate of war. Expressive of this connection is the Targum's translation of the description of victory. His hands remained steady, emunah, until the sunset. His hands were spread in prayer until the sunset. The word emunah, signifying firmness, steadiness, also expresses faith. Moses' hands become the conduits of prayer, their steadiness no longer a simple physical immobility. Almost there. Moses' posture at the top of the mountain is poignantly described by Ha'amek Davar. His hands generate faith in his people precisely by their rising and falling. It's the oscillation, the natural vibration of hands of flesh and blood that creates faith in those who watch and imitate. This gesture, tentative, delicate, and heavy at the same time, is the gesture of real human hands, not the static, iconic image of prayer in Byzantine art, for example. These hands need support, They are subject to the laws of gravity. In their sensitivity, they suggest an alternative model to that of the triumphal miraculous staff. Here is the intentionality that solicits what slips away as though it were not yet. This hand will have 4 fires engraved upon its palm. It grasps nothing, issues in no concept. I'll send you all the philosophical footnotes to this afterwards. Moses' final enigmatic failure, the narrative of the waters of Meribah that condemns him to die in the desert, is clearly focused on a regressive return to the staff modality. When he hits the rock instead of speaking to it, his hand returns to grasping, to the conceptual. At issue there is the problem of faith, of emunah, of the caressing, questioning modality that consists in seizing upon nothing and that learns its own complex stability. God said to Moshe and Aaron, because you did not have faith in me, he'emantem, to sanctify me, from the language of emunah, to sanctify me before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them, right? So because you hit the rock, because you used the grasping hand and not the oscillating, stroking hand, you did not use the hands of faith, and therefore you showed that you didn't have faith in me. If God engraves the menorah on Moshe's palm, therefore, this is to initiate a new way of knowing the fiery prototype. God tells Moshe, see it and make it, according to the pattern that you were shown on the mountain. Imprinted in his flesh, he carries an impression of the menorah in 4 fires. It is known by touch and by sight. And yet, as with Levinas's caress, it represents a quest for that which eludes touch. It is a space left within his skin that marks his memory with an absence, something precisely not grasped, right? And the play on not grasped, meaning open, and also elusive, not able to be grasped, is important here. Perhaps this is one of the associations that will sign him as the mechokek, the engraver, the lawgiver. In Deuteronomy 33:21, Moshe blesses the tribe of God. There, the portion of the mechokek is hidden. The Talmud comments, from here we learn that Moshe is called the mechokek, the lawgiver. Moshe's grave is hidden, unknown. No one knows his burial place to this day. And so Moshe is called the mechokek, the one who engraves. As she will say now, this is the source of his power as mechokek, as lawgiver. The one who can make a profound impression on the hearts of others has lived with an intimate knowledge of chakikah, of being imprinted, of a hollowness traced in the flesh. I'm going to pause here for one moment, let any folks think about comments you might like to make, and I'll be right back for last thoughts. All right. I see Lance and Bracha. Go ahead.
You can love me for this. There's a song, I want a man with a slow hand. I want a man with an easy touch. And there are two little words in italics, not yet, which I think Levinas is alluding to the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And why that's important is because Merleau-Ponty really puts concreteness, body, the lived body, over intellectualism. And I think that Professor Zornberg is really doing that. If you think about the caress, all the allusions to touch and to the body and so forth. And this is feminism. And Gaston Bachelor is a feminist. And this is a feminist reading of the Torah. It's great in that sense. I don't think that the original audience would see it this way, but again, if you go for deconstruction, then what she's saying is perfectly legitimate.
Great, great. Thank you. Love and appreciate all those comments. I like your expansion on those ideas of the embodied and the physical. Bracha, go ahead. Unmute.
Yeah, there's something about the nature of fire that it's always flowing, it's never static, and that its reach is always upward. So it's almost like a role model for how to be spiritual in a physical world.
Beautiful. I really like that added dimension of the sort of upwards and the, very much, Moshe's upward moving hands parallel that. Excellent. Excellent. David L.
So I appreciate the erudite comments of all our colleagues around here, and certainly Professor Zornberg. And I think that she's so 20th century.
Okay, great.
Because the way that we design things today and the way we manufacture things today is with light and with flow. And that if you asked a young engineer, what does it mean that God shows Moshe something in these fires? He said, well, this is easy. This is computer-assisted design and computer-assisted manufacturing. And maybe it's even printed manufacturing. But it's not hard in a world where we can actually create holograms and twist them and shape them and have different colors representing different things. It just reminds me, and then I'll shut up, of Ellie Kranzler getting his first personal assistant device, which we all have now, and making a comment. I'm not going to say it right, so I don't want to say specifically, but something to the effect of, it brings a new insight to what revelation looks like. There was a guy who had the Torah on his personal device, and he said, can you please download this for me? And that's what happened. And so, Chazal were playing with an image, or Chazal were playing with an image, and the image was actually deep. And today we understand it in a different way than they do. And I love what she does later when she talks about the open-handedness and the touch and all that stuff and the prayer and this and the fire is an image, and that's fine. It didn't need to be connected at all to the manufacture of the Mishkan, which, by the way, is not a building. It is not the same kind of building project at all. It is chattel. It is movable. I'm done. Thank you for listening.
Oh, great insights. Totally appreciate that. And the last thing I'll say on the way out is, and again, it was beyond the scope for her, and I don't remember if all the way back in Shemot she spoke about this or not. But when I think about Moshe's hands, I also think about his experience when he was first being trained by God on symbolism and signs and wonders, and he had the experience of placing his hand in his cloak and removing it, and it was mitzorat, and just that dimension also of what he has experienced through his hands and visually on his hands. But I think I'm definitely taking Yedei Moshe with me as a field for exploration and meaning. And I think there's just a tremendous amount here that's very, very rich. So great to get to learn it with you. Yep, that's on the way out.
My head. A house can be lepers.
True.
So theoretically, the Mishkan can be leprous. And what does that mean? Because leprosy is religious and not scientific. Hansen's disease is scientific, right?
Right. Fascinating. I'm sure there's discussions in Chazal about whether the Mishkan could contract tzara. That's a really kind of a mind-bending idea. So thank you. And thanks to everybody. Great to learn together. Great to be back. And as I said, I'll send the footnotes over for your further exploration, and look forward to next Monday night. And mom and dad, love and great night to all. Bye.